This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Inking Christ, a theological approach to tattoos by Dr. Justin Scoggins. This book is an invitation to view tattoos not as marks of rebellion or mere decoration, but as sacred symbols that narrate the story of one's faith and life journey. Dr. Scoggins' aim is to inspire believers to embrace the artistry of tattoos as a legitimate and meaningful form of worship, reflecting the beauty and love of Christ in a unique and personal manner. Pick it up today on Amazon.
Liminal, a word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest. Welcome back to another episode of the Liminal Living Podcast, where we're exploring the intersections, the in-between places of faith, culture, transformation, and our hearts in the whole midst of it. I'm your curator of conversations, Tom Rundell, and today we have a very thought-provoking conversation lined up with Caleb Campbell, author of Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. And I gotta say that my brain exploded a couple of times, and I said I gotta rush this episode right to the front of the line and release it early because it was so good. Caleb is not only a pastor, but a man who has lived through and deeply reflected on the cultural upheavals that we've all been witnessing since 2016. He's someone who grew up in a conservative household. Then he rebelled, became a neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and then later found himself pastoring a church. And it's the very church where his spiritual journey began. He's got a very captivating story. But also, he's got very captivating ideas. And in his book, Caleb dissects the dangerous intertwining of Christianity and nationalism in a movement that he describes not just as political, but a tribal identity and a form of spiritual idolatry. Caleb's message is one of grace and understanding and ultimately hope. And through his own undercover experiences attending Christian nationalist rallies, Caleb has sought to answer one critical question: how do we lovingly engage those who have given themselves over to a movement that seems to divide rather than unite? And he does so in his book. And we talk about that book, and we dive really deep into some themes today, and we're unpacking everything from his journey out of neo-Nazism, his path of faith, his heart for those who are trapped in fear-driven ideologies. This episode promises to challenge you, to challenge the way we think about identity and politics and how we embody the radical love of Jesus in today's world, even with those that we radically disagree with. So I'm going to invite you to go grab a cup of coffee or something comforting like that, sit back, and I want to introduce you to Caleb Campbell. Well, Caleb Campbell, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I gotta say, your sticker is amazing on that microphone. Is that a dragon? Maybe a Leviathan?
It is very Leviathanish.
Yeah, I see a Leviathan, and it's got the slash through it, and it's got a little bit of red, white, and blue going on in there. So tell me about this sticker. What is this? What's the symbology here?
It's meant to mimic the partisan icons we have. We have the elephant and the donkey representing, Democrat, Republican. And what I see happening now is that people are not primarily becoming more partisan, but becoming more culture warrior-y. And the politics is in service of that culture war mentality. So this is kind of a spoof on that, as if it was a political party, and then it's got the no smoking cross out thing on top of it to say we're not about that.
We are not about the Leviathan. I like that. That is so cool. It's like first thing I noticed was that. Well, we have about 45 minutes to dive into stuff, and I just want to know if you could tell us a little bit about your life. Like, what's the soil that you're life has come out of, and how did faith intertwine with that?
So I grew up in a theologically and politically conservative home in the holiness movement and hated it. I thought most of what church was about what you're not supposed to do. The messaging that I felt like I was receiving was predominantly like, don't smoke, don't drink, don't watch rated R movies, don't dance, etc. And in junior high, we were at one of the pastor's house, and they had the Terminator movie on cassette tape, which is rated R. And that was all I needed to recognize the whole thing was a bunch of nonsense. It was all hypocrisy. They're telling me stuff. They're telling me not to do stuff that they're doing. I'm not about that noise. High school was kind of done with faith, done with church. Kind of second half of high school, fell in with a group of neo-Nazi skinheads and became one myself. I graduated high school, but I didn't go to college. So in that kind of early, late teens, early 20s phase of life, had a job, but started asking critical questions like the ideology of neo-Nazi skinhead is white people are the master race, so it's white supremacy. And I remember asking like, well, if white people are the master race and we're supposed to like protect a future for like white people, where are all the wealthy, successful, retired skinheads? And what I recognized was that much of what was being said was not adding up to reality. It wasn't integrated. And so I started disentangling myself from that movement, moved to another part of town, and was just kind of floating in life. And a person from Desert Springs Bible Church was dialing drummers in the classified ads, and we had one. We had an ad our band did in the classifieds, and this is back when you would pay money and put something in a piece of paper that they would print and send it all over town before Craigslist. And a woman from Desert Springs Bible Church, dialing drummers, called me up and said, "Can you come play the drums at our church?" And I said, "Sure." And now I'm the lead pastor.
No way. Wow. Yeah. Well, how long are we talking between?
Yeah, so that was probably 23, 24 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, so a while.
Wow. So what was this journey to become the pastor like? You just start off as a drummer and now you're the lead pastor. Like, how connect those dots?
We were, at that time, early on, I was kind of on rotation as a drummer, but over time just became kind of like more consistent. And one of the other musicians in the band, he was a newlywed, invited me to come to he and his wife's house for dinner, and it became a weekly rhythm. And he said, after dinner we can talk about what makes you angry about religion, which that was my dominant emotion at the time. So I was like, great, I got tons of stuff. And we would have dinner and then talk about religion. Usually I'd just rant and rave, and he would be like, oh, that's interesting. Hold on a minute. And he'd go get a Bible and come back and open it up, and he'd be like, here, read this thing about Jesus. He's saying similar things to what you're saying, or I think Jesus kind of agrees with you on that point. And so he didn't tell me this, but that was discipleship. And he was introducing me to Jesus, showing me the teachings of Jesus, the way of Jesus. And over a course of about a year, doing that like basically every week, found myself following Jesus. And then after a couple years, because I was already kind of in the rotation of serving, I got asked to serve as kind of like a co-leader for a group, like a Bible study group. Eventually got asked to lead the young adult group. Came on staff in 2006 to do the young adult group, as well as a bunch of other things. Anyone who's worked at a church knows that your title is usually not the thing in isolation, but you're doing a ton of stuff. So I had great experience, opportunities to lead in different ways. Went to seminary, graduated in 2014. I was on the stay married plan, so I spent a lot of time in seminary, and stepped in the lead pastor role in 2015. My predecessor, Rick, who I still see every other week, he's still my pastor. He served there for 30 years, and we had a really great transition. It was super smooth. All of that is his grace and, generosity and humility. So in 2015, lead pastor, I thought, I know what this is about. I've been at this church for a long time. I know these people, kind of know what we're getting into. And then 2016 happened, and it unveiled that season of 2016 to 2020 really was unveiling a lot of stuff that I could not see underneath the surface in our congregation.
Yeah. That was a huge unveiling moment. You actually kind of open up your book with, like, this year is, that 2020 season was an apocalypse. And, growing up evangelical, I had a particular understanding of what that word was and what it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And seeing it used in modern day as like the revelation of what has been the underbelly of the thing has been really interesting. How, I guess, is that like the thing that caused you to say, I need to write this book called Disarming Leviathan? Like, was that the moment, or is there something else that goes into like your inspiration for it's time to write this book?
So 2016, 2020 was a season of increasing, but what I perceive to be disparate pushback. And what I mean is, starting in 2016, things that we had done for years prior, care for immigrants, care for refugees, talk about racial reconciliation. I don't ever remember getting any sort of serious pushback on those things prior to 2016. But in 2016 and on, I start getting like people in the lobby, kind of saying weird things to me, like, "Hey, don't bring that Marxism into church," or, "You sound like a lib," or, "Are you telling us we can't vote for, fill in the candidate?" And I was struck by that because we had not ever told people who to vote for. We were generally, from this stage, apolitical, Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, all in the church, predominantly conservative. But I mean, there's a statue of Barry Goldwater down the street from where I pastor. So This is the land of John McCain and Barry Goldwater. So, it's libertarian conservative. At least that's what I thought. And people that I had shared communion with for over a decade were like putting their finger in my sternum, "Hey, you got to cut back on that liberal talk." And I was so perplexed by it because I didn't see it as advocating for a partisan team. I thought we were doing Bible stuff. We're a theologically evangelical church. One of the pillars of evangelicalism is social action. And so I thought that's what we're doing, And 2020 hits, and it's Fauci, Floyd, and the federal election. And how our church responded to that, our leadership was in lockstep, our board was in lockstep, but many folks were perceiving the decisions we were making, like not gathering in person or talking about racial reconciliation when George Floyd was murdered. They perceived that as imbibing a atheist, Marxist, CRT, eventually woke agenda. And by the end of 2020, 80% of the people who were in the congregation in 2016 were gone. And much of it was around these issues. And so I was so struck because our doctrine had remained the same, our talk track had remained the same, but things out in the world were changing. And I realized, people are being discipled by somebody other than me. They're being told, they're 30 hours a week, they've got talking heads telling them things like, Glenn Beck said, if your pastor uses the phrase social justice, run from that church. Well, social justice is a phrase, a theological category I learned from very conservative theologian John Stott. I have an ESV study Bible, and one of the headers in Exodus is social justice. So I was just struck by how quickly the tide was turning, how much influence people that I didn't know and talking heads that I didn't know were influencing the people I was shepherding, and the lack of, I think, good faith questions, but rather the accusations that were coming my way. So, it was like in 2020, from basically April until the end of the year, it was like every other day I'm getting text messages, phone calls, emails, accusatorily coming at me. And people were like printing out packets from like the Daily Wire and putting it on my doorstep and knocking and running away, which in the age of the Ring doorbell is like, hey, Ethel, like I can see you. You're not. This is not anonymous as you think. And I was emotionally a wreck, spiritually distraught, physiologically. I got COVID in June of 2020, shingles in July, and then facial paralysis in August.
Oh my gosh.
So the whole right side of my face was paralyzed. All the nerves got infected and swelled up. And I got about 90% of it back, but I still have some paralysis on the right side of my face. And I went to the doctor, and he was like, have you been under any stress lately? And I was like, yeah, dude. And so I was just shot and went on a season of healing, sabbatical. Our board, again, like I said, was in lockstep. They were awesome in that time. But in 2021, I'm, in the lobby. This is after we regathered and we're having in-person services again. I'm in the lobby of the church, and people that I pastored are coming up to me, handing me flyers. And they're saying, Pastor Caleb, there's a revival happening down the street. I said, revival? That's because I look at the flyer and it looks like a rally, red, white, and blue, big stage. I think there was like a bald eagle on it, American flag, all that kind of stuff. Freedom Night is what it's called. And I'm looking at this thing, I'm like, oh, that's strange that they would use the language of revival. This looks like a rally. And about 3 miles from where I'm currently sitting, there's a mega church that had been hosting these Freedom Nights with a group called Turning Point USA, who had moved here from the East Coast. They had been connected to Jerry Falwell Jr., the Falkirk Center, TPUSA, to my knowledge, was headquartered out of that space. They moved here in 2020, either 2020 or 2021, after that kind of stuff fell apart, and began a partnership, and they were hosting these monthly rallies. And so I got enough of these invites from people that I pastored at the time. So did some of our board members. And so one of our board members and I went to one of the events, and I was absolutely terrified by what I saw. We are in a room, thousands of people, mega church, and a guy gets on stage and he says, "Get up on your feet. We're going to worship the Lord." And they did 3 worship songs that we do at my church. They did a salvation prayer. If anyone wants to receive Christ, every head bowed, every eye closed, that thing. They took an offering. And then Charlie Kirk gets up and proceeds. He doesn't talk like a political pundit. He doesn't say, "Hi, I'm here. Thank you, Pastor so-and-so. I'm here to talk to you about my conservative political beliefs," or whatever. He gets on the stage and says, "The word of God says," and then proceeds to preach, tethering the biblical text directly to his preferred political commitments as if it was orthodoxy. Statement like, the Bible's crystal clear. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And that's why we have to protect our God-given Second Amendment rights to bear arms, because you can't love your neighbor if you can't protect them from a madman with a gun. Now, whatever a person thinks about gun rights, that's fine. That is not what that text means, nowhere in the vicinity. And what was terrifying to me was not that he was doing it. That's been happening for thousands of years. What was terrifying to me is people that I pastored and this room full of my neighbors were raising their hands saying amen and hallelujah. And this syncretistic empire worship that had been merged with Christianity was being received by people that I pastored as the real McCoy, as the gospel. And they were having a worship experience. So it really is a revival. And I came to the conclusion, this is not about politics. This is something going on in the soul. This is a spiritual movement. The politics is only in service of something else, something deeper. And so that's what got me curious about the movement. So I spent a couple years doing undercover work. I went to a bunch of these revivals and all these different events. I went to their first ever pastor summit in San Diego a couple years ago. Signed up for as many of the newsletters and training videos, and met a lot of the leadership over that time. Became a biblical citizenship coach, went through their training program because I wanted to learn. I wanted to know what is going on. And at the same time, at the church that I pastor, I'm getting the question from the people that I'm pastoring, "Pastor Caleb, what do I do with my Aunt Betty? What do I do with my cousin Steve? What do I do with my niece, my nephew? My nephew just bought body armor for the 2-year-old for the impending race riot or race wars. What do I do? My Aunt Betty is saying that lizard people run the government. My cousin Steve is raging at the Christmas dinner about the invading immigrant army from whatever it is. And they're asking me for counsel, Pastor Caleb, how do I engage them? And so I set out to try to craft some kind of resource. In my mind, it would be like a few blog posts or like some kind of study guide for our church as to how do we missionally engage the folks that have given themselves over to American Christian nationalism. And it eventually, I did not intend it to be a book. It is part of my doctoral work at Fuller. That was kind of what I thought I would do. And then it got picked up by InterVarsity, which I'm very grateful for, and made a book out of it. So that's how the book came to be, was out of that pastoral heart for answering a real on-the-ground question.
Wow, I was like enthralled. And now I want to know, like, what did you learn when you went through all this training and did all this undercover stuff? And what did you learn about Christian nationalism, and what are like the values and doctrines that are like holding that thing up?
Yeah.
Tell me what you know.
So I first approached it as a heresy to fight. I thought, okay, if I could just out-Bible these people, they would repent and believe, Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest realizations I had was that they don't need enemies to fight them, right? They don't need, heretic hunters to come in and knock down the idols and, tear down the Asherah poles and all that kind of stuff. They need a missionary to reach them. And the reason is because this thing is not primarily about ideology. It's about identity. And I thought it was a political movement. And certainly American Christian nationalism has political ideology. But I understand the movement, missiologically speaking, as 3 things at the same time: a political ideology, a tribal identity, and a spiritual idolatry. The political idea or ideology is at its root that Christians should be in charge of the government to protect and propagate their way of being in the world. That's at its essence. Which kind of Christian, what kind of government, those things, depending on where you're at, they'll take on different nuance. But it's basically Christians should run the state towards their own ends, which is usually repeated by people who give themselves over to this movement. But if you ask them to talk for more than 10 minutes about that political ideology, there's nothing there. Very few of them have a well-constructed political ideology of how that would actually be in practice, which tells me that this is not actually about political ideology. But the political ideology is in service of the tribal identity and the spiritual idolatry. So the tribal identity, thinking as a missionary, American Christian nationalism refers to, as it's currently expressed, refers to an identifiable people group with origin story, taboos, fears, heroes, villains, dreams for the future, music, food, clothing, language, and customs that discern who's in and who's out. And they're usually defining themselves in contradistinction to things like groups of people like the coastal elites, or the libs, or the wokes, or the other. There's always others, the outsiders, but they're the real Americans, the true patriots, that kind of thing. And so it's a tribal identity. And for many people that I encountered, it is a surrogate for their ethnicity. So for many white people in America, there's an identity of who I am with my family and then who I am in my country. But there's a gap in the middle of who are my people, who's my tribe, who's my clan.
Yeah.
My wife is, her parents are Sicilian immigrants. She has a firm grip on her ethnic identity. I didn't. Growing up in America, I'd ask, what kind of people are we? Well, we're Americans. Well, there's all different sorts of Americans. Mm-hmm. So what's my ethnos? In the New Testament, the Greek word ethnos is the word where we get nations, which is identifiable people group. And for many inside of American Christian nationalism, this is filling that gap of what kind of a people am I from? I'm from this kind of people. And so in that sense, it's a tribal identity. Mm. Third, it's a spiritual idolatry. It is an expression of empire worship, the veneration of the power of the American military, economy, etc. I've heard people say things like, one pastor said that the United States Navy is the most vivid expression of God's right hand of justice in the world, which also speaks to syncretism, which is conflating or merging aspects of the Christian tradition and teaching with aspects of Americana. So a great example of this would be in many hymn books. There are songs that are like Amazing Grace or The Old Rugged Cross, songs that any Christian could sing no matter where they're at in the world. Then there's a section called patriotic hymns where it's like My Country 'Tis of Thee, Yankee Doodle, that kind of thing. And Christians around the world cannot sing those songs that venerate the country. And so it may seem innocuous, but in the lived experience of the average American Christian nationalist, both of them are holy texts. I'll hear people say, Ben Carson said this the other day, that the United States Constitution is divinely inspired. So it's this conflation of aspects of the Christian faith with Americana, or the American civil religion. And as I'm engaging with people, and one of the things I discovered was the problem is not in the head, it's in the heart. The reason that people are giving themselves over to American Christian nationalism is out of a perceived need and threat, namely ethnic erasure. They're afraid that their way of being in the world is under imminent threat, and that by binding themselves together in this movement and cutting checks and voting in a certain direction and advocating for certain, political postures, that their way of being in the world will be protected. And so the purveyors of American Christian nationalism are stirring anxiety and rage. If you just sign up for a newsletter and you'll see it. The enemy is at the gates. There's a big scary thing happening out there. It's going to get your kids. That's why we have to rally together and donate and vote and, et cetera, et cetera. It's the motivator is fear. And they're stirring anxiety by pointing at real phenomena that causes a bit of anxiety, but they're adding gasoline to the fire. For instance, Aunt Betty has been going to the same grocery store for 50 years. Last week, she went to the grocery store and the clerk was speaking another language to someone else in line. That causes a little anxiety in Aunt Betty because she starts to feel like her home is changing. She starts wondering, am I going to have to learn another language to go to my grocery store? The world, her favorite ice cream shop closed down last year, and in its place is an Indian restaurant. And she's not inherently against those things, but things that she loves and things that she's used to are changing, and that causes a bit of anxiety. It's the anxiety that happens to any of us when we feel like we don't have a home or that our home is under threat. Now, American Christian Nationalist leadership, they see that anxiety and they just throw gasoline on it. Have you noticed that when you go to the grocery store, they don't even speak English anymore? That's because a evil billionaire is funding hundreds of thousands of invaders to come into our community and, take our jobs and rape our kids. And there's a bit of truth in that, right? The story started with truth, but then there's this stuff that's hyperbole, it's manufactured, and that's why Aunt Betty is yelling and screaming at the 12-year-old's birthday party about the invading army. And so the problem, so I get this question, hey, what do I do with Aunt Betty? Well, imagine you're at the birthday party. The problem is not primarily the thing that she's saying. The problem is she's yelling at the 12-year-old's birthday party. Why would someone be yelling at the 12-year-old's birthday party? Well, there's good reason to yell at the 12-year-old's birthday party. Here's a good reason, Tom. If a wild bear walked into the backyard at the 12-year-old's birthday party, we should be yelling, right? Imminent threat. We need to experience our fear, and we need to express that, and we need to get out of here. She feels like there's a bear coming, and the rest of us don't see it. And that's a problem not in the head, but in the heart. And by engaging her, if I choose to engage the things that came out of her mouth first, we're going nowhere, because I will be perceived as an enemy, or she may feel humiliated, or that I'm attacking her. Instead, I want to do everything I can to connect with her heart to heart, because that's where the problem is. It's this deep anxiety, a fear of loss. She doesn't feel safe in her own home. And that's the space that I want to meet her at. And many of the people that I meet at these rallies, they feel safe in the rally. They feel like they've got a people group, that they're going to have each other's back. And so when we ask, why are people giving themselves over to this movement? It's because of the heart. This is meeting a heart level need.
I found it really interesting that you made the connection that this like this identity in Christian nationalism is like a surrogate ethnicity, because I've had some conversations with some folks. We had Grace Jisung Kim on talking about when God became white.
Yep.
And just like the understanding that white is not an ethnicity. It's just a basket that we threw fair-skinned people into. But there's like so many different ethnicities that make up that basket, but we've lost our connections and our roots to like our people and our lands and where we came from. And now it's like we have been colonized. The colonizers have lost like their roots and their people, and now we need something to fill the gap of that. And I find that really fascinating that this Christian nationalism comes and acts as a surrogate. We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. And now back to our show. And gosh, I've seen so much damage in the church since like 2016 till now. Like you just see like the graphs, they're plummeting everywhere. Do you think like this, like the damage of this Christian nationalism is a big influencer in the decline of the church and the lack of trust and witness that we actually have? Do you see like that as one of the major proponents of that? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I could speak as a pastor on the ground. In my experience, yes. There are dozens of people that used to fellowship at the congregation I serve, and they've given up on evangelical. They've given up on church. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is the unflinching commitment of so many evangelicals to the means and methods of the powers of the kingdoms of this world. Dehumanizing speech, combativeness, toxic tribalism, that we're seeing many of my evangelical peers exhibit in the name of righteousness, which is, just a cover for political gain. I know for a fact that my neighbors in my community believe that what I'm advocating for is make America great again, because I'm a white evangelical pastor. Like, it's the working assumption. I had somebody talk to me 2 years ago, and we met up, and our church had taken an offering for Afghan refugees. This is when the American military is pulling out of Afghanistan, and we knew that there would be need, so we just started taking up an offering. Made the front page of the New York Times. Now, I don't say that to self-aggrandize. Churches taking offerings to help refugees should not make the front page of the New York Times. It should just be normal. The reporter that talked to me was so struck, she kept asking, wait, you're an evangelical. Why are you helping refugees? I thought evangelicals didn't do that, which tells me that in the water, there is a malformed witness of the evangelical church that a reporter would have in her paradigm, that evangelicals not only don't take offerings for refugees, but do the opposite. And a person had read that article in my community and wanted to meet me because they wanted to ask questions. And we had a lovely conversation, but one of the things they said was, if I go to your church, will I be lynched? I said, well, why? Tell me why you say that. And they said, because I'm a Democrat. This is a person who had never been to church before, was referred to themselves as a spiritual tourist. They were very curious about the way of Jesus, had listened to a bunch of the sermons online, but their roadblock to joining us on Sunday was the working assumption that they would be not welcomed because of their currently held political affiliation. How's that reporter, how's that person, how are they getting that? They're getting that from the public witness of the evangelical church in America. So I know for a fact, at least for the people that I've encountered, this Machiavellian approach, the ends justify the means approach to political power in the name of righteousness, is marring the evangel, the good news, at least our witness to it, in my community. I live in the land of Turning Point, USA. I'm down the street from Mark Driscoll. Carrie Lake is wearing a cross around her neck, doing tours around many churches here, and then going on social media and using dehumanizing speech to talk about immigrants. So yeah, in my community, the first, before I even get a chance to share the gospel with people, I got to do all this work to say, I'm not that kind of a Christian. I'm not advocating for that kind of work. So part of why I am in this work is not to throw shade on other Christians. It's just to put the smelling salts under our nose and say, we got to wake up to the effect that this is happening on the people that we say that we're trying to reach.
Yeah. And so many of the people that I have known, it's so hard to have conversations now, because if it even sways into that realm, I experience a visceral nervous system reaction when, and I'm trying to I'm trying to do what you're doing, but maybe not to the extent. I will listen to a podcast interview with, if Donald Trump is on there, it's I will listen to that. If Tucker Carlson's on there, I will listen to that. Ben Shapiro, I'm going to listen to that, because I want to know, what is it about this that is so attractive? And yet I want to also be able to critique my own camp where I know that, because it seems like there's this polarity, that it's a winner takes all in a two-party system where, you're not from my side, then you must be for all of these things. So it's I'm an evangelical pastor, you say, you got to deconstruct everything. It's well, I'm a never Trumper. But that doesn't mean that I am 100% supporter of the other side. I actually critically think about, I'm trying to critically think about the side that I am going to be voting towards. How do we have these conversations when there's a visceral reaction in ourselves? When, it's someone close to us, a mentor, a parent figure, a family, best friend, and they're across the line, and we're experiencing our nervous system shutting down, and we just want to oh my God, how do you have a conversation when you feel that way yourself?
Yeah. 98% of the work is in me, not in them. Whenever I think about the other or the person with whom I disagree, 98% of the work is in me. And if I'm not in a place of health, I probably should keep my mouth shut. So rest, physiologically rest, Sabbath. Look at how many times Jesus just ghosted people to go away, right? I'm going up this mountain. See you guys later. I think that's instructive. Processing through our feelings. So I know in evangelicalism, feelings is sometimes a bad word, but the Bible's full of them. The Psalms, you could view it as people processing their feelings before the Lord. I think that's a great practice with, licensed people, with friends, with the Lord in prayer, but just knowing what I'm feeling. Engaging in the spiritual disciplines of introspection, dwelling on scripture, dwelling on truth of God, meditating on, Lord, search me and know me. asking, am I harboring anything towards this person? Is there malice inside of me towards them? Is there derision? Is there shame? Tom, one of the things I think is critical for us to be thinking through is, do I feel any family shame? Am I ashamed to be in relationship with them because of how they think? If I am feeling that, that's probably a me problem, not a them problem. Like, am I trying to get them to change so I can stop feeling? Again, that's me, not them.
That was a good question.
So asking those self-critical questions before we ever, open our mouth, I think is so important. I refer to my work as mission work, and every good missionary I know spends a ton of time preparing for the conversation. Prayer, asking others to pray, rest, making sure they're in a healthy place. So for every hour of conversation, there's probably 10 hours that needs to be spent in preparation for it to make sure my mind and heart are in a healthy place. Because if I meet their anxiety with anxiety, if I meet their rage with rage, not only are we not moving forward, we're probably making matters worse. And one of the questions that I've formed into a prayer, which I absolutely hate, is this. Before I go into the meeting, if I can't pray this prayer with integrity, I shouldn't open my mouth. And here's the prayer. Lord, what do you want to teach me through them? Or what do you want to change in me through them? And the reason why I don't like that is because I'm better than them. I'm smarter than them. I'm more mature than they are. I got nothing to learn from them. There's the problem, right? If I can pray that with integrity, it is, like Grandma used to say, a recognition that all ground is equal at the foot of the cross, and that we're just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread, and that I'm still in process just like they are. And for my friends who've given themselves over to American Christian nationalism, they are like Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. They're feeling fear and anxiety of loss, and so they're reaching for the most powerful thing that they know, which is the sword of government power. Well, I do that too. I'm not given over to American Christian nationalism, but I've got my own swords I reach for when I feel fear. And so I've got a lot to learn as well of what it means to follow Jesus and take on the way not of the sword, but of the cross. And so I think spending that before the meeting time in introspection and prayer, we might find that we're in a healthy space to then enter in, again, not as someone to fight, not as a warrior to dominate, but as a missionary seeking to reach through compassion, hospitality, and humble subversion.
That's good. That's very good. Very practical. I've had a couple of little brain explosions here in this conversation. I have another question. You and we're white guys, and we can easily camouflage ourselves and go into a rally and go in and look at things. People would say that that's a privilege, that we can hold a viewpoint in camouflage behind our whiteness. How would a minority who feels threatened by, anti-immigrant speech, like they're eating our cats and dogs and we need to, deport them, and that's the hot one right now, but this has existed since, in our country at least forever, dehumanizing another. We don't experience, being dehumanized like they would in a moment like that. How do you know when to prophetically flip a table in protection of a minority, and when do you know when to set the table? That's your words, flipping tables and setting tables. I love that, but I'm putting it in this context of this question of how do you know when to do that when their language is going to cause harm to people you love?
Yep, that is the question. Here are just some thoughts.
Okay.
Jesus flipped tables once. Look at how many times he set tables. So that's just for me, at least. And let me say, I want to flip the table. I want to burn the thing down. I hate American Christian nationalism. I think it's evil. I think the purveyors of American Christian nationalism are propagating evil.
Yeah.
It's ripping apart churches. It's ripping apart families. I have over 300 broken relationships that are the part of the carnage and fallout from this thing. I hate this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I want the table flipped. So, is it instructive that Jesus flipped tables once, but set tables throughout the Gospels? One theologian said Jesus ate his way through the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Why I think table setting happens more than table flipping is that table flipping drives out and table setting calls in. It's an invitation to come in. Notice who Jesus was always putting at his tables. He was always putting misfits together at tables. He was putting fishermen next to prostitutes and tax collectors. He was putting zealots who would have murdered the tax collector next to the tax collector. And he expects them to follow him in fellowship with each other, which I think is pretty profound. If we find ourselves in a space where harm is being done, it may be the time to flip the table, right? So whose tables got flipped? It was the powerful and the ones who are taking advantage. The people who are making purchases from the tables, Jesus didn't seem to direct his gaze at, but rather the ones who are intentionally taking advantage.
That's good.
I think that's instructive too. Should I yell at my Aunt Betty because she's given herself over to this thing? I don't know, maybe. But I know if I do yell, I'm driving out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if Aunt Betty is causing harm to a couple people next to me, I probably would stand up and be like, hey, let's go in the other room. Can I see you in the kitchen? That kind of thing. However, true change generally does not happen in a person's heart when their tables are flipped.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's a question of, what do you hope for? Do you hope that Aunt Betty goes away and that she's now excluded from the community without changing? She just goes somewhere else, out of my life. Okay, that may be the case. But if I want true change for my cousin, for my neighbor, for Aunt Betty, whoever it might be, that change is really going to happen if it's at the heart level. The heart only ever changes when it feels safe.
Mm-hmm.
For those who are not in a position to do that without experiencing harm, like missionaries, all of us are called to a work. Some of us are called to go, but all of us are called to pray. And so, I don't think you should go to a rally if you're under threat. By no means. I can go, and you can pray for me, and you can pray for them. Just like I'm not going to Afghanistan, but I pray for my friend who is a missionary in Afghanistan. So we all have a role to play. It's just which role are we individually called to. However, I would notice that many, even if we're not in a position to go to a rally or an event without threat of harm, we probably do have someone in our life who's given themselves over to this movement that we could safely approach. And so I still think these methods work. By and large, these methods are for people you already know, not necessarily for strangers. I'm not advocating people go meet strangers at some big event, but rather, like at Thanksgiving dinner, there might be someone in your family who starts saying some stuff, and I think the tools that we've curated in the book are helpful in those circumstances.
That's good. That's very helpful. Last question, because I know you got to go, but what is giving you hope right now when everything looks like it's on fire?
I had two young adults ask me the other day who was running for president.
Whoa.
And they were coming out of a Bible study. And it was a reminder to me that I feel like this is really crazy, and I'm really invested in the nationalistic thing that's happening in the church. they're just enthralled with Jesus, and they don't listen to the same stuff I listen to, and people aren't yelling in their life, you know. And it was a reminder to me, I couldn't believe that they asked me the question, because I thought everyone is consumed by this.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded, not only for those two, but the church around the world is not overwhelmed by this stuff. They've got their own problems, you know. And so I'm finding hope in submitting myself to the teaching of Christian, usually authors, who are coming from places that are outside of America, usually in third world countries, places where there's a coup d'etat every 20 years, places where the empire has collapsed and they're in ruin. I have an image of a pastor in Aleppo, priest in Aleppo, giving communion to 6 of his parishioners in a bombed out chapel. And so that faith that I see in them is sustaining me.
Wow. That having a larger perspective. Yeah. Thank you for that, because I need to hear that too. Oh, so where do you want to send people to buy your book and connect with what you're doing? Because I think it's really, really been a helpful conversation. I want them to read your stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Well, you can buy the book, Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor, on, well, wherever books are sold. My website is disarmingleviathan.com, and we're also on most of the social channels, and YouTube, I think. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. Well, this conversation is going to be on YouTube and as well the RSS
Beautiful.
feed. So, man, this was a great conversation, Caleb. I learned a whole lot. I just want to thank you so much for writing the book and for coming on the show. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Tom. It's been my pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Liminal Living podcast today. I hope you were inspired. I hope you were challenged. I hope your brain exploded in a couple of ways, because I definitely was for listening to Caleb's thoughts here. His book, Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor, is available wherever books are sold. I highly recommend that you go and pick up a copy. It's not just a book, it's like a guide to understanding and bridging the deep divide that we see today, especially in church and political viewpoints within church. And for more of Caleb's work, you can visit his website, disarmingleviathan.com. The links will be down in the show notes for that. And you can find additional resources like his blog, videos, and ways to connect with his other message. So if you did enjoy today's conversation, be sure to subscribe to our RSS feed here or our YouTube channel over there if you want to watch the full interview and kind of see me interacting with them. And don't forget to share this episode with someone you think might benefit from hearing Caleb's message of hope and healing. So until next time, I'm Tom Rundell, reminding you to live in those liminal spaces and embrace the in-between where we're all called to be. So, peace out.